Hello, everybody. My name is George. I'm the general manager here at Amherst Cinema. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's screening of Singing in the Rain as part of our Science on Screen series. This series is sponsored in part by a grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. I just want to express our gratitude for them and the grant and allowing programming like this to happen. Amherst Cinema is a nonprofit. We rely on memberships and donations to bring programming like this, along with first-run films to all 4 of our screens 365 days a year. We show around 300 films a year, and we only are able to do that with your support. So it's really, really unlikely that all of you see 300 movies in a year. So when you think about the 7 to 20 you do see, that remaining 275 or so, you are underwriting the cost of bringing those amazing films to our region. So we thank you if you're a member, and if you're not, we encourage you to become one so we can continue bringing a full schedule of robust programming, such as tonight's program. Tonight's guest is a good friend of the cinema. She's done a bunch of talks for us. I hope you've seen some of them. If not, hopefully we'll have her back again in the future. Nina Kleinberg had worked in Hollywood as a filmmaker and a film editor, so she has a pretty unique perspective on talking about making films and what it means. She's also has just a wonderful history and knowledge and in-depth knowledge of film, so she can talk very expertly on that, and so we really appreciate her ability to unpack it from an insider's view and from a fan's view. So we'd like to welcome Nina Kleinberg, who will provide an introduction to tonight's presentation of Singing in the Rain.
Hi, folks. You're going to find Singin' in the Rain on the list, every list on the internet of the best films, not just the best musicals, the best movies, right up there with Vertigo and Casablanca. And a lot of you are probably thinking, why does it say science on screen? What does this movie have to do with science when this is what you think of when you think of this movie? So if that's the image you have of this movie, I think we're missing one of the great reasons why this is, I think, head and shoulders above most of the great musicals, including most of the great MGM musicals. We have a light on the... Yeah, okay. We'll get rid of that. We're not just talking about the usual plot. Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl. Yeah, that's in the movie, but that's all taken care of and settled in the first 40 minutes. That's a given. But what sets this apart and why Hollywood loves it, it's because it's about Hollywood. And this is what the plot is based on.
Hello. This is a demonstration of a talking picture. Notice, it is a picture of me and I am talking. Note how my lips and the sounds issuing from them are synchronized together in perfect unison.
Come out from behind that screen, Mr. Simpson.
No, I'm right here.
Of my voice has been recorded on a record. A talking picture.
So this film is set at the end of the 1920s, and it focuses on a cataclysmic time in Hollywood movie history when talking pictures totally and utterly replaced silence. To tell the story of Singing in the Rain from a scientific perspective, we need to look at 3 different points in movie history. So we're going to start at the end of the 19th century and go forward to the mid-20s and look at the development of sound technology. Then we're going to see what the movie business and movie making were like in the 20s, both before and after the Great Transition. And we're going to try to understand why synchronized sound took so long to be adopted by the Hollywood studios. And finally, towards the end of the talk, just a few brief words about who made the film in 1952. So let's get started. In 1877, you've heard of him, Thomas Edison, and he invented the first machine that could not only record sound but play it back.
Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
It used air vibrations caused by sound to create a groove in the recording material. He started off with tinfoil, then he went to wax cylinders, finally wax discs. And you remember those wax discs. We used to call them records. Edison didn't invent the movie business, but he did take advantage of the technology and something called a kinetoscope. And this was a machine that ran a film by a crank, and you looked through it and you cranked the handle and you saw a moving image. And they recorded all kinds of weird stuff. People put together movie parlors where you'd go and watch all kinds of movies. They charged you 5 cents, hence the term Nickelodeon. Now, when you combined a kinetoscope with a phonograph, you had a movie with sound. But there was really no way to amplify this movie. And they did have some primitive earbuds back then, but that was about it. It was a one-person experience. Before we go any further, I want to clear up a misnomer, and that is silent films were never silent. They were almost always accompanied by some kind of music, and many of the large movie palaces had orchestras. Here's a scene from the beginning of tonight's movie. And you'll notice they've just shown their latest silent film, and they have a large orchestra accompanying them. Now, in many small towns, they didn't have large orchestras. Sometimes they would just have individual piano players. And sometimes the projectionist was also the sound engineer and provided sound effects. So let's get back to some early experiments with recording sound and picture. Films with synchronized sound were actually as old as the movie business itself. Here's one that was done in 1895 by Dixon in Edison's studio in New Jersey. But talking pictures, that is, films with synchronized voices, took a lot longer to catch on. Here's one, however, that was done as early as 1905.
Pouvez-vous darder dindon dans le flanc, votre Maheude, au cœur, votre bleu cordon, les coquilles des ma pointe voltige, une mousse, décidément c'est au bedon qu'à la fin de l'envoi le...
Now, the importance of good music was always appreciated, and some of the larger budget films actually hired some very well-known composers to write scores just for their films. Here's one of them. This is the Duc de Guise. I also want to talk a little bit about lip syncing, dubbing, because in Singin' in the Rain, it looks as if Cosmo is inventing lip syncing.
Come here. Now sing.
Huh?
I said sing. Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, Don, keep your eyes riveted on my face.
All night through. Good morning to you.
Watch my mouth.
Good morning. It's great to stay up late. Good morning to
Well,
you.
convincing?
Except that here's a film from 1907 that already was using lip syncing.
Allons enfants de la patrie, le jour de gloire est arrivé. Contre nous de la tyrannie, l'étendard sanglant élevé.
So then why, with all this wonderful technology, did movies with synchronized sound take so long? And without synchronized sound, they lasted into the 20s. And to answer that question, we're going to have to look at some of the technological challenges that went into it. Now, one major challenge was the microphone. Here's Edison's machine, and that big horn is both the microphone and the speaker, but you had to make a really loud noise into that if you wanted to record anything, and obviously if you put that next to somebody's face, you were not going to be able to record their voice. So it wasn't really until the invention of the condenser microphone in 1914 that you could actually have someone talk and not see the microphone. Then there was the problem of amplification. They didn't know how to make it loud enough. They had all these rigged machines with big horns, but nothing really worked. Now, it wasn't until the invention of electrified amplification and loudspeakers that you could play it back loud enough that you could actually hear it in a large audience. There is there's some argument about who actually invented this, but you have to give a shout out to Lee DeForest, who invented the first vacuum tube. Now, there's a rumor that he didn't actually understand exactly why it worked, but it did. He called it the audion tube, and this was one of the first ways that they got the output so loud. Then there was the issue of what to record the sound on. And up till the 1920s, Edison's wax disc did the best job of reproducing sound. But of course, it brought with it another challenge, and that was the issue of synchronization. How could you make the picture and the sound run together in perfect sync?
The sound. It's out of synchronization.
Well, tell them to fix it.
Yes, sir.
The air is miles away, you witch.
No, no, no.
Yes, yes, yes.
The human ear is actually very, very sensitive to sync. Here's a scene from the beginning of the movie that's only half a second out of sync.
Always dignity. This was instilled in me by Mom and Dad from the very beginning. They sent me to the finest schools, including dancing school. That's where I first met Cosmo.
Even 8 frames out of sync is enough to make you
Always
not want to
dignity.
watch it.
This was instilled in me by Mom and Dad from the very beginning. They sent me to the finest schools, including dancing school. That's where I first met Cosmo.
So as long as you had 2 separate media, you had the film starting and stopping 24 frames a second, you had the sound coming out of a phonograph smoothly, the possibilities were endless. You had all these Rube Goldberg kinds of machines, but the records would skip and the film would break, and there you'd lost sync. Now, the idea of recording the sound directly on film had been in the works since the 1910s. Because if both the picture and the sound were on the same medium, you had solved this problem. In 1900, a German inventor, Ernst Römer, created something he called a photographophone, and it used some of the technology from the telephone to using electrical impulses from a microphone. They were converted by a transformer into variable patterns of light and dark. And then those patterns of light would be projected through a lens onto a strip of film. The real work of this was done by this guy, Eugène Lost, and he demonstrated the possibility of this solution to the problem early on. He invented a projector that could both show the image and play the recorded sound. An image would be recorded running alongside the film that by either changing the area of density, of darkness and light, or the density could be interpreted as sound. his early work was hampered by a lack of funding, and also film stock was awful, and development of the film led to a lot of crackle and hiss in the soundtrack. So that at this point, the best recording was done on Edison's wax discs, and there are people today who still prefer vinyl records to anything digital. And as Lost was making progress with the concept of sound on film, what should happen? World War I intervened, his funding dried up, and his work would only be picked up after the war. War is always good for technology, not good for much else. But a lot of the technology that went into the development of synchronized sound on film was developed during World War I. Here's Charlie Chaplin, and early in the war, trying to get everyone to buy war bonds using a megaphone. By the end of the war, there were amplification systems that could fill an entire arena. So here we are, mid-20s now, and the Hollywood studios are making money hand over fist. The motion picture business is the 5th largest industry in the country, right up there with steel and railroads and automobiles. So-called silent films could be exported all over the world. All you had to do was change the language on the intertitles, and you could send your film to Germany or Latin America or China, wherever you wanted to. Why would they change anything? The public was not clamoring for a change in their weekly entertainment. But a big change was coming, and it threatened Hollywood's bottom line. And that big threat was the presence of electronic voices coming into the home by phonograph, and even more of a threat, radio.
This is station STAR, the voice of Hollywood.
As box office revenue started to drop off, the movie industry began to feel pressure to change something. It's always the money that makes things change. And it's hard to turn the course of a mighty ship. It takes a visionary, someone from the outside, to threaten the course of events. And that visionary was this man, Sam Warner. He and his 3 brothers had founded Warner Brothers Studio in the early 1900s. They actually started by running Nickelodeon parlors. In Hollywood, they were considered the minor leagues. Their biggest star was a 4-legged furry creature named Rin Tin Tim. And in the 20s, they were struggling financially. But Sam was what we call an early adopter. He was in New York, and he went to watch a demonstration of something called Vitaphone. And what it was, it combined sound on disc, synchronized to a projected moving picture. It had been invented by the folks at Western Electric. He convinced his brother Harry to see a demonstration, and Harry was impressed, but not by the sync speech. Now, Harry is often quoted as saying this: "Who the hell wants to hear actors talk?" But that's not the full quote. What he actually said was something to the effect of, "They'll come for the music, but who wants to hear them talk?" What he really wanted to do was bring high-class entertainment to the masses with sound so realistic that you might think the orchestra was hiding behind the screen. And this was one of their tests. So Warner Brothers bet their bankroll and their reputation on a synchronized sound film called Don Juan. The film itself only had synchronized music and sound effects. There was no talking. It's John Barrymore. This film, however, was preceded by 9 short subjects, all with synchronized sound and voice. And it was these short subjects that really wowed the audience. So the audience was impressed, but they still weren't clamoring for talking pictures. And at the same time, Lee DeForest, and you remember him, and Theodore Case, who was another kind of privately funded genius, were working to improve sound on film technology.
The finished film employed for reproduction in the motion picture theater, therefore, carries not only the picture of the action that is to be seen, as it did in the silent picture days, but also the photographic record of the sound that is to be heard.
So that's how he explained it, and that's how it worked up until digital, not that long ago. The sound came off the film came off the supply reel, went to the shutter gate where it was held in place, a shutter opened, the light went through it, the shutter closed, the film was advanced 1 frame, and you repeated that 24 times a second. However, your sound could not be stopped and started 24 times a second, so it was rolled around a drum till it was moving slowly and smoothly and read over a sound head before it was taken up with the reel. With this new system, they produced some wonderful short subjects, and this is one of my favorites.
I got a crown, you got a crown, all God's children got crowns. And when we get to heaven, gonna put on the crown, gonna shout all over God's heaven, 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 heaven. And everybody talks about heaven, ain't going there. Heaven, 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 gotta shout all over God's heaven.
In helping to make the amazing record, which is to be produced of this scene, I have only the most general idea of what it is, mechanically and scientifically, that is being done.
Yeah, they even recruited a Western Mass local, making him the first U.S. president to be recorded in sync sound.
But I am assured that a photo film of this scene is to be produced, combining a record both for the eye and the ear.
How's that? Can you feel the air?
Case wanted it to be so
I'd like to know whether
lifelike
you
you
can
would
feel the
really
air coming
think
to
you were in the room
you
with
people
him.
that are sitting there and watching this picture.
Here's another one of my favorite Case films.
He wants to marry me and be my honeybee. He is a fatty just like Joey. When he left, he shakes his shoulder. He's kissing me.
I love Gus Visser. Anyhow, Case and DeForest had a falling out over who would get credit for the new system, but Case was able to convince another Hollywood mogul, this is William Fox of Fox Pictures, and Fox and Case formed the Fox Case Corporation, and Fox immediately saw the benefits of sound on film. In addition to providing more reliable synchronization, the system was portable. It didn't require heavy machinery in a large studio, and the new system was called Fox Movie Tone, and it was quickly put to use in the first sound newsreels, so that when Charles Lindbergh took off on his flight, the next day there was synchronized sound film being shown in the theaters in New York. This was also the beginning of film as propaganda. Oop, that was
Just a
Mussolini.
toy.
Let's go back just so you can see
It's
him.
vulgar.
Oh, what the hell.
RF, do you think they'll ever really use it?
So, do you think they'll ever use it? Was it going to be worth the enormous expense to make the shift? And would the public go for it?
I doubt it. The Warner Brothers are making a whole talking picture with this gadget. The jazz singer. They'll lose their shirts. What do you think of it, Dexter?
It'll never amount to a thing.
Yeah, that's what they said about the horseless carriage.
Now, there's a quote often attributed to Henry Ford. It's probably apocryphal, but it goes like this. If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. The public didn't know it wanted talkies, not yet. And the turning point came in 1927 when Warner Brothers bought the rights to a Broadway show called The Jazz Singer. In the lead role, they cast Al Jolson, who was the most popular singer of the day. It was not, as some people think, an all-talking picture. 90% was silent with music and subtitles, but 6 of his musical numbers were shown with synchronized sound.
Blue sky, smiling at me, nothing but blue sky do I see. Ho-to-to, bluebird, singing a song, nothing but little bluebird all day long.
But what really got them was a dialogue between him and his mother that he improvised. He was supposed to stop singing, and instead he kept talking, and the camera and the sound kept rolling.
Mama, darling, if I'm a success in this show, well, we're going to move from here. Oh, yes, we're going to move up in the Bronx. A lot of nice green grass up there, and a whole lot of people you know. There's the Ginsbergs, the Guttenbergs, and the Goldbergs. Oh, a whole lot of birds. I don't know them all. And I'm going to buy you a nice black silk dress, Mama. You see, Mrs. Friedman, the butcher's wife, she'll be jealous of you.
Oh, no.
Yes, she will. You see if she isn't.
It may have been a small spark, but this was the spark that lit the conflagration. And what delighted audiences was it wasn't acting. It was very intimate. It was, no one was performing. It was as if you were sitting in on a conversation. Now, the major studios were very wary. Most of them got together and decided they wouldn't do talking pictures unless they all did talking pictures. But the pressure was on, and Warner and Fox forged ahead. So, if The Jazz Singer was not the first all-talking picture, let me show you what was. It was an execrable film called The Lights of New York, and I have watched it so you don't have to. No one knew how to write movie dialogue, so the dialogue all sounds like titles. And the sound engineers warned everybody, don't talk over each other, so the rhythm of the dialogue is lugubrious. No one had invented a boom yet to put the microphone on, so they're all talking into hidden mics. And you may remember that there's a scene just like this, Where to Talk, from our movie tonight.
Don't you remember I told you? There's a microphone right there, in the bush.
Yeah.
You have to talk into it.
So here's, someone take a guess as to where they hide the mic in this scene from The Lights of New York.
I want you guys to make him disappear.
Disappear?
Well, certainly. If they don't find him, it will cinch everything for us. Don't you understand?
What you mean?
Take him for a ride.
Oh.
You think you could stand an hour and a half of that? Anyhow, the acting might have worked in a silent film, but when you heard, you know, this is what it would have looked like if it were a silent film. But when you heard the actors actually say the words, it just sounded melodramatic and ludicrous.
I've lived and I've loved and I've lost.
The only really interesting scene is one where a gangster is murdered, and this plays out basically like a silent film with shadows and sound effects. It didn't matter. The audiences rushed to see The Lights of New York. They couldn't get enough of it. It was a marvel. And the die was cast. The audience voted with their feet and with their wallet, and Hollywood couldn't stop it anymore. Now, in the year that The Lights of New York was made, a great silent film was made. This is by Fritz Murnau, often considered one of the greatest silent films ever made. And it had beautiful camera work, beautiful lighting. It was such a brilliant film. See this sometime if you can. It didn't matter. The Lights of New York made $1.2 million. Sunrise made $800,000, and Hollywood was in the business of making money, not making art. In the words of the great film historian Kevin Brownlow, by making the transition to talking pictures, the Hollywood moguls killed an art, but saved an industry. And the answer to Harry Warner's question, who the hell wants to hear actors talk? Apparently, the answer was everybody. And within a mere 4 years, silent films were dead.
What a laugh, yeah? That doesn't mean a thing.
Thousands of theaters were outfitted for sound. The old stages were torn down to make way for noise-free sound stages. And cameras were noisy.
All right, here we go. Quiet! Roll 'em!
So they put the cameras in soundproof boxes, and the beautiful art of moving the camera was lost for a brief time. Here's what it looked like to make a sound film, a musical, in 1930. A noisy camera in a sound booth. Three cameras running at once, so at least you could get different angles. But the real king was the sound technician. If it wasn't okay for sound, it wasn't okay. Now, very quickly, they figured out how to liberate the camera and sound equipment from the confines of the studio. And the first talking picture shot outdoors was actually this one, a Western.
Everybody come out of the court.
It's the Cisco Kid.
Hold up, we're lucky if we get away with our lives.
Oh, I didn't come on this trip. I don't.
Keep him out, Claude. No trip.
And those of you who saw my Western talks know I'm pretty sure that this is where they hid the microphone. They also figured out how to silence the noisy cameras. That blimp was actually invented by the great Arthur Edison, who shot Casablanca. Now, with every paradigm shift, there are winners and losers. The war between Vitaphone, sound on disc, and Movietone, sound on film, was over in a few years. They were like the VHS and the Betamax of their day, only in this case, the better system won. Sound on film was perfected, and the struggle to keep things synchronized was solved for good. Of course, the biggest losers were those movie stars whose voices could not make the transition. They either couldn't figure out how to memorize their lines or act. Then there were the writers. Writers who could create pithy titles couldn't write dialogue. Also, within 4 years of the advent of sound films, 40,000 musicians were put out of work. All the people who had been in those orchestras and those little one-person sound houses, movie houses, and this was at the height of the Great Depression. It killed vaudeville. Why pay to see a live actor when you could see them on screen? Now, who were the winners? New careers were invented. Sound engineers, sound effects specialists, great novelists like Faulkner, and other great novelists came to Hollywood to see if they could get a job that paid better than being a novelist, writing screenplays. The biggest winners were the banks in New York. The infrastructure cost so much to rebuild the stages and the theaters that the big banks got their hands on Hollywood and they never let go. And there was never a question, again, of whether movie making was a business or an art. What ties our themes all together are these two people, and especially Arthur Freed. Arthur Freed was one of the big winners. He began his career as a songwriter in partnership in the 1920s with Natio Herb Brown.
It's a holiday, today's the wedding of the painted dolls. It's a jolly day, the news is spreading all around the hall.
Freed and Brown wrote the songs for MGM's first musical, The Broadway Melody, and it was the first sound film to win the Academy Award for Best Film.
Old Broadway, you've got a clown on Broadway. Your troubles there are out of style, for Broadway always wears a smile.
And their collaboration was so successful that they wrote most of the songs for the Hollywood Review of 1929, where the title song from tonight's film had its debut, although it would be used many times over the next decades.
I'm singing in the rain, just singing in the rain. What a glorious feeling, I'm happy again.
You wrote that this morning?
Yeah, it's something they remember.
Yeah, I remember it already.
I walk down the lane with a happy refrain and I'm singing in the rain. I'm singing in the rain, just singing in the rain. What a glorious feeling, I'm happy again. I'm laughing at clouds so dark above, the sun's in the heart and ready for love.
It was also Arthur Freed who convinced MGM to buy the movie rights to The Wizard of Oz, and although he's not credited, he really was the creative genius behind that film.
Oh, we're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz. Here he is, the Wizard of Wiz, if ever a whiz there was. If ever, oh, ever a whiz there was, the Wizard of Oz is one thing.
And as a result of his creativity and success, he formed the Freed Unit, which was its own production company within MGM that hired only the best. And he made many of the great musicals of the 1940s and 50s. Here are just a few of them. And he produced many musicals that were based on the collective songs of popular songwriters, including the Gershwins, American in Paris. While they were working on that, Freed decided it was time for him to put together a movie based on all of his songs, and he hired two wonderful screenwriters to write the script. You may have heard of Betty Comden and Adolph Green. They had written Broadway shows like On the Town and Wonderful Town, and here's what he asked them to do.
We came in one day and he said, you're going to write a movie called Singin' in the Rain, and you'll get all my songs into it. And that was very difficult. We knew there'd have to be a scene where someone would be singing and it would be raining. That's all we knew.
Now remember, this is 1951. The film came out in 1952, which meant that the transition from silence to talkies was 25 years old. And there were still plenty of people on the MGM lot who remembered those days and gave them all kinds of ideas, which you will see in the film tonight, for funny things that happened. Also, Adolph Green was a great historian, and he knew all about film history and worked so much of it into tonight's movie. So that's how we come to have this wonderful film, which you're going to see tonight. I'll stick around for Q&A after if you want to talk about the people who made it or more of the technology or whatever else is on your mind. And now I just want you to enjoy this absolutely glorious movie.